At my wife's funeral, someone called me. I am still alive, don't trust anyone. The moment those words echoed through my phone, the world around me froze. The priest was still speaking. Her photograph was framed in lilies, and my hands were trembling so badly that the phone nearly slipped. For 3 weeks I'd believed she was gone, burned in a car that was unrecognizable, cremated before I could see her face. I buried her. I cried like a man who had lost everything. And now someone with her voice, her tone, her quiet breath between words, was telling me she was alive. My eyes scanned the crowd, her family, her sister clutching a tissue, the neighbor who kept avoiding my gaze, the officer who handled the accident. Suddenly, every detail of that day felt wrong. The sealed casket, the quick insurance approval, the missing security footage from the intersection. I thought grief was the worst thing a man could endure. I was wrong. Deception hurts much deeper, especially when the dead start calling you. I didn't leave the cemetery right away. People came to shake my hand, whisper their condolences, hand me flowers I didn't want. But my mind was already miles away, stuck on that voice. Her voice. After everyone left, I sat in the car and replayed the call over and over, but the number was unknown. The line went dead the second she said those words. I tried to call back, nothing. I stared at my reflection in the rearview mirror and didn't recognize the man looking back. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, 3 weeks of paperwork, condolences and sympathy messages, and all along she might have been alive. I drove straight to the police station and demanded to speak with the detective who handled the crash. His name was Harper, a man in his late 50s with the kind of tired eyes that had seen too much. When I told him about the call, he frowned, clicked his pen and said, "You're grieving, Daniel. Sometimes grief does strange things." I slammed my hand on the desk so hard that papers fluttered off. It wasn't my imagination. It was her. She said she's alive. He sighed, said he'd check with the phone company, but his tone told me he wouldn't. That night I didn't go home. I drove to the crash site, the stretch of highway where her car had supposedly gone off the bridge. The railing had been replaced, the scorch marks gone, but I could still smell burned rubber when I stepped out. I walked to the edge and looked down into the dark water below. My flashlight beam caught something, a fragment of glass embedded in the concrete. It was from her pendant, the one she always wore. I pocketed it, my heart pounding. A truck passed by, its headlights slicing through the mist, and for a moment I thought I saw a silhouette standing by the trees on the opposite side, a woman motionless, watching. I shouted, ran toward her, but when I got there, the place was empty. Only footprints, small, fresh, leading back to the road and disappearing into the dirt. I took photos. My hands were shaking, but my mind was clear. Someone staged that accident. Someone wanted her gone, or wanted me to believe she was. The next morning I checked the bank accounts. 3 days after the funeral, a withdrawal $4,200 from an ATM 2 towns over. Her card had been deactivated by the police, supposedly destroyed as part of the investigation. I printed the statement, circled the date, and drove to the bank. The clerk looked at me with confusion when I showed him the paper. "This card shouldn't exist," he said. "It's been reported as cancelled." He showed me the camera footage from that ATM. It wasn't clear, but the woman using it had her height, her hair color, her way of holding her bag. I froze the frame and zoomed in. The bracelet on her wrist? It was the one I gave her for our 10th anniversary. I whispered her name. For the first time in weeks, I felt something I thought I'd buried with her. Anger. If she was alive, she'd lied to everyone. To me, but why? That night I went through every file from the crash. The coroner's report, the insurance claim, the police statements. I found one inconsistency. The autopsy listed a scar on the victim's left shoulder. My wife's scar was on the right. I called Harper again. He didn't pick up. 2 hours later, someone broke into my house. They didn't steal anything. They just went through my desk, the place where I kept those documents, and left the front door wide open. The message was clear. Stop digging. But they underestimated me. Because if she really was alive, if she thought she could disappear and leave me in the ruins she built, then she didn't know me at all. By the 4th day after that call, I had stopped pretending to function like a normal man. I called in sick, pulled the curtains shut, and surrounded myself with folders, receipts, printouts, and every piece of paper connected to her death. I read every line again, and what started to look like random bureaucracy slowly formed a pattern. The coroner's report had been signed by a temporary substitute, not the city's regular examiner. The towing report for her car was logged under a company that didn't exist before that week. And the accident photo in the file, the one supposedly showing her burned-out vehicle, had the wrong license plate. It was off by one number, a clerical error maybe, but I'd spent 12 years of my life in finance. Numbers don't just shift without reason, so I began cross-checking line by line. When I finally matched that incorrect plate, I found it belonged to a car registered to Elliott & Crane Holdings, an offshore consulting firm based in Delaware. I had never heard of them, but my wife had worked as a project coordinator for a real estate group that quietly used the same accounting agency. The agency's name was Crane and Harlow Associates. I felt the ground tilt. At first I thought I was losing my mind, seeing connections that weren't there. But then I found an email chain between her and a man named Victor Crane, saved on an old hard drive she used for freelance work. It was encrypted, but the subject line was enough. Exit strategy, final transfer. My pulse thudded so hard I thought my veins might burst. I sent the drive to a friend of mine from college, Greg, who worked in cybersecurity and owed me a few favors. He promised to decrypt it within 48 hours. That same night I started receiving silent phone calls every few hours. No number, no sound, just breathing. The first time I hung up, the second time I listened, the third time I said, "If you're alive, tell me where you are." The line went dead. I barely slept. When Greg called me the next morning, his voice was shaking. "Dan, whatever this is, you don't want it." The emails. They're about offshore transfers, property deeds, and coded messages involving names I've seen in financial crime briefings. "I'm sending you everything, but destroy it afterward." My wife wasn't just alive, she was running from something, or part of it. The emails mentioned a safe house, a liquidation, and a date circled in red, April 22nd. That was 2 weeks from now. And attached was a receipt for a flight to Lisbon, booked under a fake name but paid with her old joint account. I drove straight to Harper again. His office door was closed, blinds drawn. The receptionist said he was on leave. "When did that happen?" I asked. "Yesterday morning," she said. He said he had a family emergency. I left the building with a sinking feeling in my gut. That evening, I noticed a black sedan parked across from my driveway, engine idling, lights off. When I stepped out to check, it drove away slowly, like it wanted me to see it but not catch it. The next day, Greg's house burned down. Total loss. The news called it an accidental electrical fire. They never found his phone. That was when I realized I wasn't just chasing a missing wife. I was stepping into something that could swallow me whole. I left my house that night with only a backpack, my laptop, a burner phone, and a printed copy of those decrypted files. I drove 5 hours north, booked a room under a false name in a roadside motel, and stared at her emails again. Every line screamed code. "The documents are with the lawyer in Fairfield. Once the transfer clears, we vanish. If Daniel finds out, it's over." My name. She had written my name. At dawn, I drove to Fairfield, a small coastal town where we used to vacation once a year. There was one law firm there, Mason and Crane LLP. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. I parked across the street, watching through the windshield as employees arrived. Then I saw him, Harper, the detective who told me to move on, wearing civilian clothes and unlocking the front door of the building like he belonged there. I took photos. Then I followed him inside, pretending to be a client. The receptionist smiled, asked if I had an appointment. I said yes, one with Mr. Harper. She hesitated, then led me to a small meeting room with glass walls. When he walked in and saw me, the color drained from his face. "You should have stayed home, Daniel," he said quietly. I placed the photos of the ATM withdrawal on the table, the burnt pendant beside them. "Where is she?" He exhaled through his nose, lowered his eyes, and whispered, "If you love her, stop looking." I leaned forward, my voice steady. "If I stop, she's dead for real." He stared at me for a long moment, then said, "They'll kill both of you if you keep digging." I asked who they were. He didn't answer. He slid a folded paper across the table. "She left this for you," he said. It was a handwritten note. "Don't follow me. I did it to protect you." No signature, but the handwriting was hers. I looked at him, but Harper was already walking toward the door. When I opened the paper again, there was something else scribbled faintly in pencil on the back, almost invisible under the light. A single word, warehouse. Then a set of coordinates. I drove there immediately. It was an abandoned freight terminal near the docks, reeking of salt and rust. The coordinates led me to a locked steel container. On its door, painted in red spray, were the letters E and C, Elliott and Crane. I pried the lock open with a crowbar I found nearby, stepped inside and froze. There were boxes stacked to the ceiling, all labeled with account numbers, property records, passports, fake IDs, hundreds of them. It wasn't just her disappearance. It was an entire network laundering money through real estate, insurance, and fake accidents. She hadn't died. She'd been erased, and I had just found the body of proof that could destroy everyone involved, including her. I stood there, with my hands black with dust and paper cuts, a cold kind of fury settling into my bones, and for the first time since the phone rang at the graveside, I felt like I had a direction. The boxes were a ledger of lies, forged wills, duplicate deeds with different beneficiaries, LLC formation papers for shell companies listed under names I'd never heard, and wire transfer receipts. One for $87,000 dated March 9th, one for $200 stamped as consulting fee on February 2nd, and another for $2,500,000 marked asset liquidation with a client reference that matched an address of a house we used to visit in Cape Cod. There was also a typed list, names, dates, and a column titled Status, with entries like active, closed, erasure. And there, stapled to a contract, was a notarized signature that matched hers, except the initials on the back of the page were wrong, a tiny loop missing in the A that my wife always made. It was sloppy and desperate, and it was evidence. I photographed everything with my phone, then stuffed the most incriminating pages into my backpack, knowing any paper left behind could vanish by sunrise. I drove back to the motel and laid it, all across the bed like pieces of a map, my hands trembling as I arranged the receipts and passports into a coherent trail. The emails Greg decrypted were a skeleton key. The container was the muscle. If I could tie the paper trail to a legal entity, to bank accounts, to a public record, I could force the hand of whoever thought they were invisible. I called an old friend from law school, Marcus Hale, a small-time litigator who owed me one for that misfiled brief in '09. Marcus answered on the second ring, voice rough with sleep. I didn't explain. I started talking fast, throwing names and numbers at him and repeating the word somehow like a prayer. Crane. He said 3 words that made my throat close. Don't go alone. He told me to meet him in the city in 4 hours. I hung up and burned the motel room down to its essentials. Copies of everything, a fresh burner, a printed list of the men and companies I could identify. In the taxi to the train station, I told myself I was doing this for her, for whatever part of her was left and for the part of me that still demanded answers. But there was also another voice, the one that had been quieter for 12 years, whispering about contracts and leverage and the right moment to strike. Marcus met me at a coffee shop with a legal briefcase and a look that said he'd been preparing for a war. He spread the documents on the table, pointed to the $2,500,000 transfer, and said, "This is the pivot." He traced a line with his finger to a notarized affidavit that showed the seller on a Cape Cod property had been forced to accept a cashier's check from an entity called Elliott and Crane Holdings on April 22nd last year. April 22nd. The date made my stomach drop. It matched the email with the red circle in my wife's decrypted folder. Marcus leaned in and said exactly what I needed to hear. We don't need to prove everything criminally to start breaking these people. We start civil, freeze assets, get an injunction, and use discovery to blow open their books. If there's money tied to those deeds, we can attach. He wrote down 3 specific actions. 1. Immediate filing for a temporary restraining order, an asset freeze on any properties linked to the identified LLCs. 2. A demand letter to the banks that handled suspicious wire transfers. And 3. A petition to reopen the coroner's final report based on the SCAR mismatch and irregular notarizations. He added, almost as an afterthought, "You'll need more than us. Find a banker who hates offshore tricks and a reporter who can't be bought." We had the banker in 36 hours. A contacts list in the container included a compliance officer named Elena Morales, at a small private bank in New Jersey, who'd flagged unusual activity and then gone silent. Marcus called her under the pretext of an audit. She agreed to meet if we could show credible cause. The reporter was easier, an investigative journalist named Lila Chen, who liked her bylines messy and her sources brave. I called Lila and left a message. "I have documents. I have receipts they killed a woman on paper." She called back within the hour. By the time we filed the TRO, the civil complaint, and the demand for expedited discovery, the chain reaction started. Elliott and Crane Holdings tried to bury us with delay tactics. Their attorneys sent boilerplate denials, accused us of harassment and demanded a retraction. Marcus, patient and methodical, pushed for emergency relief, citing the forged deeds and the money trail that linked back to the Crane accounts. The judge issued a temporary freeze on any assets directly tied to the LLCs we'd identified, and the banks, spooked by subpoenas and the possibility of being implicated in money laundering, began to hand over internal memos and transfer logs. It felt like pulling a thread from a sweater and watching the entire sleeve unravel. Meanwhile, Lila ran a piece with the headline that made my stomach both drop and tighten. Erased, how a network of shell companies profited from fake deaths. She quoted from our affidavits, showed the ATM footage with the bracelet, and included a photo of the container I'd taken on my way out. The article hit like a charge. Calls began to pour in from victims who'd lost houses, from a former employee at Crane and Harlow, who whispered about kickbacks, and then, disturbingly, from people who called to warn me to stop. One voicemail in a clipped voice said, "We don't want headlines, we want quiet settlements." I faxed it to Marcus and he laughed, then told me to sleep with one eye open. The discovery depositions were brutal. Bankers who'd been reassured by signed affidavits suddenly remembered details. Account signatories emerged, and internal emails showed that certain payouts had been labeled settlement facilitation and routed through an escrow company with ties to a shell in the Caymans. Under oath, a manager from Crane and Harlow slipped and identified a beneficiary, a trust with my wife's name on it, created 2 weeks before her death. Marcus pounced, and we served subpoenas for the trust documents. They came back with a twist. The trust was real, but the beneficiary was listed under a variant of her name, and the signatures were notarized on a date when the coroner had already declared her dead. The holes were becoming caverns. Public pressure mounted. The police reopened parts of the investigation after Lila's story. Harper, the detective who had told me to stop loving, was moved to internal affairs, pending a probe into his ties with Mason and Crane LLP. The media began mentioning names, and Elliott and Crane Holdings issued statements denying wrongdoing. They threatened countersuits. Their PR team painted us as opportunists. I expected threats. What I didn't expect was for my wife to call me that night from an unknown number and say, in that voice I could recognize from 100 ordinary mornings in our kitchen, "Don't go to the press." "You're making it worse." My hands went ice cold. "Where are you?" I demanded. She laughed, a brittle sound. "You wouldn't understand. I did it to protect you." Marcus listened to the recording and frowned. Either she's alive and under duress, or someone is mimicking her perfectly. Either way, your presence is a liability. He was right. The civil case was working, but the deeper we dug, the more dangerous the terrain. We subpoenaed flight manifests and found the Lisbon booking paid from an account that had been drained to zero the same week of the funeral. We traced a chain of real estate transfers through 3 LLCs, one of which had a mailbox in an industrial park and a representative who refused to answer our deposition. Then a small victory. A banker's memo surfaced showing a transfer of $350,000 routed through Mason and Crane LLP's client account for expedited closure. When Marcus dug into Mason and Crane's files, he found a client ledger with names that matched the list from the container, and one entry explicitly labeled Irageur Fund. That single phrase, typed into an official ledger, was a smoking gun. As discovery forced accounts to be opened and testimonies to be recorded, there were arrests. 2 mid-level accountants were taken from their homes. One lawyer resigned. A private investigator tied to Elliott and Crane was indicted for document falsification. The public spectacle was satisfying in a way I'd never thought a man could feel after losing love. Cold, precise, efficient. But the wins carried a cost. Someone burned my car in the motel parking lot, leaving a message spray-painted on the shutter. Stop digging. I slept in a safe house, watched by Elena and 2 former compliance officers who had promised their help. Lila's next article laid out the legal evidence and quoted my affidavit. Calls flooded into the DA's office. A grand jury subpoena followed. Then the twist I hadn't seen coming. The coroner's office announced they had found an administrative error, the wrong victim tag assigned at the scene, and that they would reopen the autopsy. It was a vindication, but also a public humiliation for those who'd relied on the initial report. The defense lawyers tried to paint my wife as a willing participant in the scheme, an architect who'd faked her own death to escape debts and legal exposure. It cut like salt, but Marcus warned me not to take the bait in public. Don't defend her, he said. Let the paper trail do it. Your role is to pry open the vault. So I stayed silent while the lawyers argued. Discovery revealed more. Hidden accounts, a fake charity used to launder checks, and a shell corporation that owned a string of properties now subject to our freeze order. In order to secure a permanent injunction, Marcus advised a bold step. A civil forfeiture claim tied to the Erasure Fund and the $2,500,000 property transfer. We filed it on a Tuesday. By Friday, the court temporarily transferred control of 2 properties to a receivership. The receivership team walked through a house on Cape Cod and found receipts, passports, and in a locked safe, a stack of photographs, pictures of my wife smiling at different beaches, different cities, each with a tiny notation, verified, relocated, closed. It was a record of movement, not death. I felt sick and elated at once. The DA finally convened the grand jury. As witnesses testified, layers of the scheme came off like rotten paint. The indictment named names, executives at Crane and Harlow, contractors at the towing company, and, shockingly, a partner at Mason & Crane LLP. The courtroom became a theater of small betrayals and large denials. In depositions, one man kept referring to protocol and minimizing fallout, as if people could be minimized like spreadsheets. I sat through weeks of testimony and learned to steady my breath as if it were another kind of work. Then came the day the DA offered me a protection plan, enter witness protection, and testify in exchange for immunity for cooperating with the probe. It felt like a cruel joke. I refused. I wanted answers, not an exile. The prosecutors pressed. There were threats to my safety, evidence that people had paid to make witnesses disappear. I thought of Greg, of the black sedan, of the note in Harper's hand. Marcus advised caution. You can expose them without vanishing, but it will be messy. So we planned a public scene, the kind that would make disappearing them impossible. We scheduled a press conference, the DA, Lila Chen, and me in front of the courthouse, to announce the indictments and to release newly obtained documents proving the fraud. I practiced what I would say. I told myself not to plead, not to beg, but to speak facts. The morning of the press conference, a man approached me outside my hotel and handed me an envelope. Inside was a single Polaroid, my wife, alive, but with a hood over her head, and below it, a message scrawled in block letters, "Stop or she dies." I stood there with the plane ticket in my pocket, the receiver document in my bag, and the knowledge that whatever I said at the podium could make her real death inevitable. Marcus wanted me to go on stage and recite every corruption we'd uncovered. The DA wanted closure. Lila urged me to go public to prevent backroom deals. My phone vibrated. The caller ID flashed a number I recognized, an old contact for a private security firm. Eleanor had tracked it. "They're watching the route to the courthouse," she whispered into the line. "And we can reroute, but if you cancel, they win." I made a choice that bruised me. I went to the podium. I told the cameras the truth we had. Forgeries, shell companies, the Erasure Fund, the $2,500,000 property transfer, the ATM footage with the bracelet, and the notary inconsistencies. I spoke slowly, each figure a hammer blow. $87,000, $2,500,000, numbers that suddenly meant human theft. I read the line from the note Harper had slid across the table. "Don't follow me. I did it to protect you." I asked the parked cameras one question. If someone could fake a death and sell a life back to the highest bidder, who would be safe? The press ate it up. The public outrage gave the DA leverage for harsher charges, and judges who might have hesitated were forced to act. Overnight, sealed indictments proliferated. Men were arrested in their suits at dinner tables, others cuffed at private clubs. Elliott and Crane's board resigned, and the firm's stock crumbled. But the victories were stitched through with a deeper torment. I still hadn't found her. In the chaos, a voicemail arrived, the same clipped voice as the Polaroid. Last chance. Walk away. I realized then that vengeance wasn't only about unmasking a criminal enterprise. It was about whether I would let them dictate the terms of my life. So I changed the rules. I stopped hunting for her with my anger, and started hunting for the ledger that would make survival impossible for the people who'd orchestrated this. I used the court's discovery powers to force banks to reveal correspondent accounts, subpoenas to freeze the Cayman conduits, and deposition traps to turn minor players into witnesses. I also used something I'd learned in finance. Leverage can come from the smallest exposed vulnerability. I found a clause in a shell company contract that required a local trustee to countersign any major transfer. That trustee was a man named Jacob Moreau, who ran a small notary office and loved order more than money. Marcus sat across from Moreau in a deposition and watched as the man, faced with public records and conflicting signatures, cracked. Under oath, Moreau admitted he'd been paid to notarize documents without verifying signatories because he'd been assured by counsel. His testimony tied the front men to the back offices, and with it, the remaining protective layers peeled away. The case moved from civil to criminal fast after Moreau's admission. There were guilty pleas and plea deals that named higher-ups as co-conspirators. In the end, several executives faced prison time, and the receivership liquidated properties to repay victims. The newspapers printed my name next to phrases like whistleblower husband and man who refused to accept a death. It felt ridiculous and hollow. I still woke in the night imagining her walking through our front door, whole and furious and alive, and then, in the same breath, imagining her in a room with no windows and a hood over her head. The final turn came not from me, but from a terrified accountant who wanted a lighter sentence. He gave us the coordinates of a safe house in southern Portugal and a cache of flight manifests that matched the fake passports found in the container. My wife's identity was listed under 3 aliases. One of the passports had a photo that, when enhanced, was her. The prosecutors moved quickly. A joint task force coordinated with Interpol and Portuguese authorities. They raided the safe house at dawn. The footage shown in court later made my knees buckle. A woman, not bound but visibly exhausted, answered the door in a robe. She was thinner, hair shorter, and there were dark crescents under her eyes, but her face, at the angle of her jaw, the freckle near her lip, was unmistakable. I was at the embassy when they told me. I wanted to run. I wanted to sit very still and let the world sort itself out. Instead, Marcus insisted on restraint. The prosecutors wanted her debriefed. They wanted to ensure the safety of witnesses and to secure testimony that could stick to the remaining defendants. She agreed to talk. In a sterile interview room, I watched her on a live feed. And then I heard her voice for real, not a crackly phone, not a voicemail, but her, breathing and human. She said, "I did it. I vanished on purpose." The confession that followed was like a blade and a balm at once. She described threats, blackmail, and a moment when she'd been told the only way to protect me was to disappear and allow them to claim her life while she worked from the shadows to bring them down. She said she thought she could control it, that she would be a ghost that fed information to the right people. She hadn't planned for greed to swallow the plan, nor for the people around her to start using her disappearance as a business. "I thought if I was gone, they'd stop coming for you," she whispered. "I thought I could clean the books." The prosecutors listened, their pens scratching. The DA offered her a deal, full cooperation and protective placement in exchange for testimony. She accepted, but with conditions. She wanted to be present to face those who'd taken her life on paper and to watch the receivership strip assets and return what they could. The trials that followed were public, ugly and necessary. Men who once sat in boardrooms were led into courtrooms and forced to answer for the human cost of their spreadsheets. Some received prison sentences, others settlements. Mason and Crane LLP lost its license in multiple states. The receivership auctioned off properties and returned funds to victims. For months, the press fed on every motion and every plea. I testified. I read into the record the dates and the figures. April 22nd, the $2,500,000 transfer, the $87,000 cash out, the $350,000 erasure fund payment. Each number was a small, precise revenge, a ledger entry converted into consequence. When it was over, when the gavel finally came down on one case and then another, there was a tremulous kind of peace. My wife, allowed out of protective custody under strict terms, walked toward me in a small room with 2 chairs and no witnesses. She was different in ways both subtle and enormous. There were apologies, truths, and a hunger for ordinary life. We talked for hours in that empty room and for longer after, but things had changed. The man I had been the day I buried her was not the same man who had stood in courtrooms and called accountants to testify. I had learned to be precise with numbers and cruel only to injustice. Vengeance, when it worked, had the cold efficiency of a contract. It was not a movie final where everything was righted. It was paperwork and subpoenas and late-night calls. It was also, unexpectedly, a kind of salvation. The last scene of the trial was not cinematic. It was bureaucratic. A judge signing an order that returned certain assets to named victims, a clerk stamping files, a receiver handing over keys. Outside the courthouse, Lila Chen asked me, "Do you feel vindicated?" I looked at the crowd of cameras and flat-screen reporters and felt the strange satisfaction of accountability. I said, "Justice was done, but nothing brings back what was taken." She printed the quote. Later, when the dust settled and the receivership closed, we reclaimed a small house that had not been part of the fraud, but felt like a place to start. I fixed the porch light and mowed the lawn. Every night I checked the locks. The world did not suddenly become safe. There were still men who resented exposure. I installed cameras, got new phones, and kept my documents in 2 bank safety deposit boxes. But there was a life to be lived. Mornings with coffee and laughter that felt tentative and real. My wife and I did months of sessions with a counselor who specialized in trauma and deception. She read aloud from a journal she had kept while in hiding. The entries were patchy, honest, and horrifically human. She apologized for the silence that had been a blade in the back of my life. I forgave her in pieces, not in one glorious moment, and she accepted the weight of her choices. As for the man I had become, the law had changed me, from someone who measured life by comfort to someone who measured it by the clarity of a signature and the solidity of a deed. I still wake some nights hearing that voice from the funeral, the one who said, "I'm still alive, don't trust anyone." Now when I hear it, it is a warning that helped me unmask a machine of cruelty. I sometimes wonder if I went too far, if the receivership and the trials and the ruined reputations were a penance or a cure. In quiet moments I tell myself this: I did not set out to ruin lives for sport. I set out to expose a system that monetized human disappearance. If the cost of exposing it was forcing men to answer for their crimes, then the scales, imperfect and slow, finally tipped. The ledger closed, not with a flourish but with a detailed accounting. And when neighbors ask how it felt to stare down men in suits and bank ledgers and to emerge on the other side, I tell them simply, I learned that revenge can be a form of repair when it forces systems to account for people, when it trades spectacle for restitution and leaves room. Awkward, painful, human, for the living to rebuild. The weeks after the trial felt like I was walking through fog. Reporters moved on to other scandals, prosecutors took new cases, and the files that had consumed my life were sealed and stored in archives. On paper it was over, but the story didn't end with verdicts. Real life leaves messier ledgers. The morning after the last hearing, I woke before dawn to the sound of a car idling outside. Old reflexes. I pulled the curtain back, nothing but condensation and an empty street. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being accounted for by someone else's spreadsheet. I went downstairs, brewed coffee, and watched the first light catch the dust in the kitchen. My wife was sitting at the table, wrapped in a sweater 2 sizes too big, staring at her hands. We hadn't spoken much since the sentencing. Everything between us had been documented by lawyers and therapists, and yet there were entire countries of silence left unexplored. She finally said, "Do you ever wish you'd just believed I was dead?" I wanted to say no, but the truth was complicated. Belief would have been easier. Truth was a slow, bureaucratic resurrection. If I had, I said, none of them would have been stopped. She nodded like she understood, but I could tell the cost still lived inside her. The house we lived in now had plain walls and no family photos. We kept it that way deliberately. Anonymity was safety. I spent my days consulting for firms that needed ethics compliance. Ironic maybe, but the only thing I still trusted was paper trails. At night I organized the restitution fund victims had started. Widows, retirees, families who'd been told their relatives were dead to cover stolen properties. They sent me letters, some grateful, some furious. One woman wrote, "You made them pay, but you can't give us our time back." She was right. Justice repays money, not years. My wife volunteered under a different name at a shelter. She still refused interviews, still avoided mirrors for long stretches of time. She told me once that every time she looked at her reflection, she saw the version of herself that lied to survive. We learned to share a quiet routine. Separate days, the same dinner table, the same ritual of locking doors. For months it worked, fragile but real. Then one afternoon, a package arrived with no return address. Inside was a thumb drive and a note. The rest of the ledger. I hesitated for hours before opening it. When I finally did, it revealed scanned files, transactions from accounts that hadn't been part of the trial. Billions, not millions. Offshore, layered through charities and endowments. It meant the network wasn't dead. It had just gone to ground. I forwarded the drive to Marcus. He called me an hour later, voice tight. "You realize what this means? The Crane structure was just one limb. There are others." He told me to drop it, that we had our closure. But that's not how numbers work for me. When a line doesn't add up, I have to find the missing figure. That night I told my wife. Her eyes widened in a way I hadn't seen since Portugal. "You promised," she said. "We were done." I told her I wasn't chasing revenge anymore. I was chasing completion. She laughed, bitter. That's what they said when they built the first fund. Still, she didn't stop me. I rented a storage unit and began mapping the files, drawing new lines of connection. The thumb drive pointed to accounts tied to energy infrastructure projects and political donors. It was larger, older and more institutional than anything we'd uncovered before. Marcus refused to file anything formally, so I approached Lila again. She'd been promoted. Her new series focused on systemic corruption. She met me at a diner, off the interstate, brought a recorder, and listened for 3 straight hours while I laid out the data. When I finished, she said, "This isn't another scandal, it's a mirror." She promised to verify and call me before publishing. A week later, she vanished. Her phone disconnected. Her newsroom cleared her desk. The official story said, "Personal leave." I knew better. I went back to Marcus, demanded we use the documents as leverage. He said, "Leverage on who? You expose a system this big, it doesn't collapse, it swallows you." We argued until dawn. He called me obsessed. I called him afraid. Maybe we were both right. I tried tracing Lila's last movements through her notes in the cloud. She'd uploaded one partial draft titled Ledger 2, Continuity of Power. The byline space was empty. 2 days later, an email arrived from her account with a single attachment. A photo of a lighthouse, coordinates attached, and 3 words. It never ended. I packed a bag, told my wife I had to follow the lead. She didn't argue, she just stood in the doorway and said quietly, "If you go back into it, I can't follow." I kissed her forehead and left. The coordinates led to the Maine coast, a small decommissioned lighthouse now privately owned. The keeper's logbook listed its owner as E&C Maritime Research, a familiar abbreviation. The gate was unlocked. Inside, the ground floor was filled with old radio equipment. In a drawer, I found hard drives labeled with dates, mostly recent. I plugged one into my laptop and watched as spreadsheets bloomed across the screen. Transfers, stock purchases, political donations, all linked through a web of subsidiaries that made Elliott & Crane look like a local scam. This was transnational. And one file at the bottom labeled Accounts Portugal Ops, listed beneficiaries under pseudonyms. One of them matched my wife's old alias. My breath caught. She had testified, turned witness, and yet her name was still being used. It wasn't over for her either. That's when I heard footsteps upstairs, slow, deliberate, the creak of an old floorboard. I closed the laptop and drew the small pistol Marcus had forced me to carry since the trial. A man descended halfway down the spiral stairs, tall, grey-suited, no visible weapon. He smiled, polite as a banker. "Mr. Daniels," he said, using the false name I'd used at the motel months ago, "we've been expecting you." I didn't answer. He gestured toward the desk. "You've done impressive work, but you've only seen the surface." I asked who we was. He chuckled. "The owners, the ones who write the ledgers, not read them." He said they'd built systems to absorb scandals, to turn exposure into profit, crash a market, buy the rubble. "Your wife was an asset, Mr. Daniels, a very efficient one until she tried to play savior." My grip tightened. "Where's Lila?" He tilted his head. "Redeployed." I took a step forward, weapon raised. He didn't flinch. "You can't kill the ledger," he said softly, "so you can only balance it." He turned and walked back up, leaving the echo of his words behind like a curse. I left the lighthouse with the drives and a new understanding that what we'd destroyed was a single department in a corporation of corruption. Back home, I told my wife everything. She listened silently, then said, "Then we publish everything, no deals, no filters. We spent weeks encrypting, duplicating, distributing the data to multiple journalists, academic archives, and watchdogs. If they silenced one of us, the others would still have the files." The stories broke in bursts: offshore collusion, political bribery, tax evasion rings. Governments couldn't ignore it. Hearings were launched, portfolios collapsed, and anonymous sources leaked internal memos proving everything we'd found. Through it all, I felt both alive and hollow. My wife and I barely spoke except to verify facts. Sometimes I caught her looking at me like she was memorizing my face, as if she expected one of us to vanish again. Then one morning she was gone. No note, no call, only her ring left on the kitchen counter. It felt almost merciful, her disappearing before the next storm hit. Marcus called that afternoon. "She's safe," he said. "Witness security again. Voluntary this time." I asked if she'd said anything. He paused. "Only that she trusts you'll finish the ledger." I laughed for the first time in months, a dry, exhausted sound. "Because finishing the ledger isn't about numbers anymore. It's about writing the final line that makes the whole thing human." The last file we released contained no balances, no transfers, only names of victims, their stories, what they'd lost, what was returned. Lila reappeared under a pseudonym, continuing the work. Marcus took a teaching position. I stayed behind a different desk, teaching younger auditors how to see deceit hiding in perfect symmetry. At night, I walk the shoreline behind our house and think about everything those years cost. I wonder sometimes if the call at the funeral was fate or just a glitch in someone's cover-up, if I'd never answered, whether the machine would have kept turning unchallenged. Maybe it still is. But I've learned something in the years since. Revenge isn't fire or blood, it's arithmetic. It's balance sheets and accountability. It's making sure that for every life erased, there's a line item that brings the truth back into the ledger. And as long as there's one unbalanced account left, I'll keep the books open. The next months were a strange, slow collapse and a sharp, jagged rebuilding all at once, as if someone had taken a house of cards and reassembled it into a fortress that still hummed with phantom drafts. I threw myself into the ledger work the way men throw themselves at grief, methodically, without ceremony, with the stubborn certainty that if I could account for every entry, I could make sense of the chaos. The public inquiry spun on rails, and committees, hearings, a parade of witnesses who had once signed checks and now coughed up confessions under oath. But the private work was quieter and colder, tracing correspondent banks through shell layers, requisitioning records from jurisdictions that used to be blind to subpoenas, coaxing reluctant compliance officers into admitting what they'd seen and then hidden. There were nights when I fell asleep at my desk, graphs blurred into the ceiling, and mornings when the telephone would bleed with calls from claimants who wanted their names on restitution lists. I learned to speak in dates and amounts. April 22nd, 300,000, 350,000, Erasure Fund. Those numbers became a second language that I used to map who had taken what and who had paid whom to forget it. The receivership continued to unearth small atrocities. A nursing home deed transferred under the name of a shell company, a life insurance policy assigned to an LLC the day after a funeral. Records of loss adjustments that lined pockets rather than covered damages. Each recovered asset felt less like victory and more like inventory, cataloguing debts owed to people who could never regain time. My wife watched me sift and file with a look I could not read. Sometimes she read the letters of victims aloud to me, in a voice stripped of accusation, a ritual of bearing witness. Other times she would disappear for days, answering only when Marcus called and telling him she needed space, that the noise had become noise she could not inhabit. I stopped asking why she had chosen to vanish in the first place. The why had been answered enough times in court. The deeper mystery that kept me awake was the moral arithmetic of what we had done. We forced bankers to account, lawyers to answer, and men who trafficked in erasure to stand in fluorescent-lit courtrooms and hear their names read like indictments. We had made a ledger painful to balance, and yet the ledger kept breathing. New conduits opened in places we hadn't engineered for. Small firms that seemed innocent were quietly absorbed and repurposed. Every time we cut one head from the Hydra, two more tiny, legalistic tendrils slipped into the dark. That was the Leviathan's defense. Institutional camouflage and infinite jurisdictional patience. I began to understand that prosecution and receivership were necessary but insufficient. Systems adapt. So we shifted from litigation to architecture. Eleanor and a handful of compliance officers I'd come to trust began designing a different infrastructure. Stricter global vetting for property transfers, mandatory cross-jurisdictional checks for beneficiary changes, a registry for high-risk notaries tied to sanctions lists. We were not just dragging them into court, we were building walls that made the same trick harder. It felt like building a dam in a river that was determined to reroute itself. Amid the legal scaffolding, life tried awkwardly to be ordinary. There were small domestic victories. A quiet morning when my wife made coffee and we shared a newspaper. The garden growing a stubborn row of tomatoes. The first laugh that broke between us because I'd burned the toast. Those moments were brittle and miraculous in equal measure. But the ledger had teeth. A retired executive who'd been humiliated into cooperation surfaced with a whispered threat. Finish the ledger and you finish us. Don't be surprised if someone finds a reason to make your name disappear. The threat was polite, economical and specific, the way people with power threaten. It should have frightened me into retreat. Instead, it hardened me into a calculus. I strengthened our security shells, rotated safe deposit keys, and moved critical files to multiple jurisdictions. We encrypted and escrowed data with watchdog groups and foreign academics who would publish if anything happened to us. Transparency, we decided, was the best guard. Then a different kind of fracture came. An old friend, someone who'd worked quietly on asset recovery in Eastern Europe, called to say he'd been approached to facilitate a settlement that smelled wrong. He told me that some intermediaries still believed they could whitewash the ledger with a generous donation, with a restitution fund that left control in their hands. I met him at a nondescript diner and listened to a plan that would let men buy silence with charters. I refused, and the refusal turned him cold. Within days, he was found dead of an apparent overdose. The coroner's report read like a bureaucratic shrug. Family members suspected otherwise. The ledger had a reach that was not only financial, it had a way of making people bend. That death reopened old wounds. I realized revenge had mutated into a stewardship I hadn't consented to carry. Protect the victims, finish the structural reforms, and shield anyone who helped us. I took on that role with the same grim discipline I'd used to parse receipts. We set up a formal restitution trust, audited and transparent with international trustees. We established whistleblower protections in legal memos circulated to compliance offices worldwide. Slowly, painfully, the ecosystem began to stiffen. Small firms that had once taken dirty money found themselves unemployable. Banks instituted stricter KYC protocols. Notaries we'd exposed were blacklisted and prosecuted. Some of the men who'd laughed in private rooms now pleaded for leniency in exchange for names. The press that had once consumed the spectacle began to cover the systemic reforms. Papers ran pieces on how to spot erasure schemes, Law reviews published articles proposing universal registries for beneficiary changes. Regulators created task forces. I tried to believe that our work had structural permanence. Then the personal cost arrived again, sharp and unforgiving. My wife, who had chosen twice to be a ghost and who had worked with the DA to topple empires, decided she could no longer stay visible in my life. "Oh, you have a face now," she said one evening as rain marched down the window. "They can see it. They can make it a target." I thought once I came back, maybe I could be contained. I was wrong. She left for a third time, this time with more planning and legal cover, taking a witness protection identity I'd helped negotiate, and asking only one thing: finish the ledger so she could step back into a life that might be ordinary. The parting was not cinematic. There were no final words, only a legal affidavit and a password that opened an encrypted archive where she'd left notes to me, not apologies but instructions on going on without her. I read those files until the early hours and thought about the odd contract we'd made with suffering. To expose a system, we accepted the cost of never having the simple certainty of who would be at our table each night. Months slipped into a new rhythm. The ledger closed on many accounts. We distributed funds to people who needed small recoveries and to organizations that would guard against erasure. Lila resurfaced as a pseudonymous columnist for a watchdog journal and continued to name names. Marcus moved into academia, but stayed on retainer as counsel. Elena joined an international compliance board. The world dimly improved, like a scar that tightens and leaves tissue ready for new life. And yet, as the public outrages cooled, I felt a persistent ache for the line we hadn't drawn, the human ledger. We had balanced books, but could we balance what had been taken from people who never got a day back? I started to build that, a small foundation to fund counseling, to help families reclaim identities, to ensure that victims of erasure had legal and psychological support. It was modest. It was necessary. That work kept me close to the human cost, to the letters we still received from people who had been told their loved one had died, and who had spent years grieving a life that had been sold. In late autumn, a new file arrived in my inbox labeled simply "Unclosed," a list of names, tiny accounts, a few numbers and a date, December 3rd. It was a reminder that the ledger breathes in whispers and that our work is never truly done. I sat down and for the first time in years felt something like the old resolve sharpen into something quieter. Not revenge for its own sake, nor the thrill of exposure, but the persistence to keep accounting until there were fewer blank spaces on the ledgers of people's lives. Winter came quietly that year, as if even the wind had grown tired of carrying the echoes of names and numbers. I moved to a smaller house near the edge of a lake, no neighbors close enough to ask questions, no reporters left to remember. The ledger was technically complete, the restitution funds distributed, the reforms codified. The last victims had been paid, and the world, indifferent as ever, had already turned to new scandals. My days became slow arithmetic. Coffee, correspondence, small consultancy work for auditors who still wanted to learn what transparency really meant. The silence was enormous. I thought about her often, about the second funeral that never happened, about how her last message was a series of instructions on passwords and safety, never a goodbye. Sometimes I imagined her reading a newspaper, under a false name somewhere far away, smiling faintly when she saw a headline about reforms she had once helped ignite. Other nights I dreamed of the phone call, the one that had started everything. I'd wake with the same phrase vibrating through my skull: "I'm still alive. Don't trust anyone." It no longer sounded like a warning. It sounded like a creed. In time, the world remembered what it prefers: comfort. Banks went back to laundering under new aliases. Lawyers found creative ways to rename old crimes. But the mechanisms we built stayed. The records could not be erased. I'd done what I could. That was the hardest part to accept. Not that evil persists, but that justice is only maintenance, never closure. Some evenings I sit by the window with the lamp off, watching the dark water of the lake mirror the moon. On those nights when the air feels too still, my phone sometimes buzzes with an unknown number. I never answer anymore. The calls always stop after one ring. I take it as a sign that somewhere, someone is still balancing their own account, still finishing a story that began with a lie and a ledger. And maybe that's enough. Maybe the real revenge was turning a system built on disappearance into one that remembers. Do you think I went too far, or not far enough?